Good evening and welcome to Portland Place, and a special welcome to Your Excellency, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, to the RIBA. I'm Ben Derbyshire, I'm the current president. Before we begin, a housekeeping point, which is to ask you not to use any audio-visual recording of tonight's event. That's strictly forbidden and copyrighted by Charles Jencks. And we're filming the event so that you'll be able to watch it on our website, architecture.com. So please switch off your phones and sit back and enjoy this in real time. In a few moments, we will call to the stage tonight's award winner and speaker. But before we do, I'd like to add my own very warm welcome on behalf of the RIBA to the recipient of the 2018 RIBA Charles Jencks Award, Alejandro Aravena. Ladies and gentlemen. The award is given to an individual or a practice which has made a major contribution simultaneously to the theory and practice of architecture. And I'm particularly looking forward to Alejandro talking about the relationship between architecture and social housing. It's a matter of incredible importance to us all at this time. So the RIBA Charles Jencks Award has premiated the work of very many talented architects, such as Bernadetta Tagliabue, Rem Koolhaas, Charles Correa, Wolf Prix, Zaha Hadid, Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, just to name a few. So this year's winner, Alejandro Aravena, joins distinguished company as a deserving winner of the 2018 award. In fact, this completes a very satisfying trio from my first year as president of the RIBA of distinguished practitioners of social architecture. Niamh Brown for our gold medal and De Reich Marsh Morgan for last year's Sterling Prize. Acute observers amongst you will have noticed that we have departed recently from that tradition, but that's perhaps a story for another time. The RIBA is, as ever, tremendously grateful to designer, author, broadcaster, and patron of architecture, Charles Jencks, for his generous donation that enables this annual award. Through the work of Charles Jencks, his writing and his commitment to the benefits of great architecture and landscape, he has been an inspiration to architects for many years, and I'm only sorry that he can't be here tonight himself, as he's recuperating successfully, I gather, from an operation. So now, just to say a few more words about the award and its history, I would like to invite his daughter, Lily Jencks, to the stage. Welcome, and thank you very much indeed.
Hi. As Ben just said, this annual award is given to an individual or practice who has made a simultaneous contribution to the theory and practice of architecture. So what is this combination of theory and practice? Why is it important? As a student asked me recently, why do we even have theory? What does it do? This award offers a theory of theories. If we look back at the people who've won the award, we see a pluralistic list. The common ground between Peter Eisenman, Zaha Hadid, Rem Koolhaas, Bernadetta Tagliabue, Neil McLaughlin, to name a recent few, is that they display multiple intelligences. Their practice is always architecture plus another discipline, not just building, but also a medium out beyond architecture. That's philosophy for Eisenman, painting for Zaha, journalism for Rem, and the collaborative time design of Benedetta, or the installations of drawings of Neil McLaughlin. The point is that theory should not be narrowly defined as a written text in the lineage of Vitruvius, or even the idealistic, beautiful drawings of Serlio. This award asks that we celebrate multiple intelligences that great architectural work entails. The idea partly comes from Howard Gardner, who is a developmental psychologist and established the theory of multiple intelligences. He argued that value could be found not only in the narrow defines of the IQ test, but there are also linguistic, musical, spatial, body, kinesiistic, and emotional intelligences, to name a few that he defined. The award was established by my father, Charles Jencks, in 2003, and he shares that polymathic tendency himself in his work as a critic, a writer, an architect, a landscape architect, a landform artist, and several others. And it comes partly from his writing about Le Corbusier, who could have alternatively pull out a model, a plan, a painting, a polemic. He was a kind of architectural Swiss army knife. And using these different intelligences to drive his architecture, he drove the other models of production at the same time. The study of architecture, in architecture schools, the study of history has mostly been valid. The Bauhaus made a strong push to move aside history and establish workshops and laboratories as the move to creatively push architecture from the side. In the 1970s, we saw the rise of paper architecture and written theory. And history theory, so history became history theory, the workshop laboratory, and today it's the statistician, scriptwriter, the artist, and activist. So if I come back to my student's original question, what is the purpose of theory defined in this sense? I expect it is the drive. It's the drive to take us into realms that we had not expected. It gives us the courage of our convictions and a critical sense of ourselves to see the work through other mode of productions and other techniques of thought. My sense is that tonight's winner portrays this clearly as an intelligence of engagement and a theory of synthesis. It focuses his architecture's ability to address today's most urgent and complex problems. I'm very looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm David Gloucester. I'm Director of Education at the RIBA. Thank you very much, Lily, and a warm welcome to Alejandro and his colleagues from Elemental. Now, I know there's always an issue with support acts, so I really absolutely promise to be as brief as possible. It's a great pleasure to host this special event celebrating such a distinguished architect and a body of remarkable work. It affirms the visceral, life-changing effect of great architecture. And perhaps we don't do that nearly enough. And this is architecture that so beautifully mirrors the issues that Lily talks about and the essence of Charles's aspirations for this award. Charles has a deep conviction that practice without theory is inherently problematic, but that theory needs to be tested through the revelation of realizing the architectural project, through building. All of you should know, anecdotally, that Charles is a remarkably challenging person to work with. He elevates each judging session of the Jencks Award to a different kind of level. It becomes a formidable intellectual exchange above anything else. So when Charles leans forward, his eyes flashing and his eyes moving from side to side to make sure that everybody is concentrating, he will say, "But we should debate this." And you need to know at this point, not knocking the microphone in any possible way, that your arguments need to be authentic, they need to be persuasive. If you're making a nomination for this award, you need to be on firm ground. The decision to make Alejandro the recipient of the Jencks Award was not difficult. Alejandro's work is diverse, inclusive, highly tectonic, and personifies the architect as a versatile problem solver with unique gifts. Alejandro is an architect who has a manifesto, a sense of what the future of our urban centres will look like, an extraordinary talent for placemaking that lodges in the individual and collective memory. And he in his practice worked with an unfaltering moral and ethical conviction, and most importantly, produce very beautiful architecture. Architecture for the mind and body. And as I know, he will let you see in the presentation. Just to explain operationally how we'll finish off the evening, we're very lucky to have Justin McGurk, who's the Chief Curator at the Design Museum, who knows Alejandro and his work extremely well. And after Alejandro's presentation, he and Justin will take their seat in the famous brown chairs, which are a fixture of the Jencks Award, for a kind of Q&A session. This is essentially a way of finishing the evening by personalising some of the issues which Alejandro will present. But for now, lords, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce with great pleasure Alejandro Aravena.
Buenas tardes. Good evening. So I would like to start by thanking Charles Jencks, Lily, the RIBA, the jury for this award. So on behalf of Elemental, our practice, who happens to have all the partners here, which I would like to quickly stand up: Juan Ignacio Cerda here, Gonzalo Arteaga, Diego Torres, and Victor Odo. Thank you very much for this award. It is an honor, and at the same time, it is a challenge. It is a challenge because the relationship between theory and practice is challenging itself. So tonight, I would like to share in three ways in which I have experienced such challenging relationship. First of all, how it was through the formative years, which I gave the title kind of thing, to being as nerd as possible, yet skeptic. I'm very happy to deliver a lecture in an environment that is from within the discipline. Normally we have to talk with no architects. It's very unusual for us to speak to architects, so finally to be able to be nerd again, it's a real pleasure. So it's fantastic. Second, a second moment where theory was only what was needed to face the problem of the blank page. And somehow it was the opposite of my formative years. And that's why I guess it's we call Elemental not a think tank, but a do tank. And it's a challenging, conflicting relationship in any case. And finally, I would like to share, because it's very much along the lines that what was just said, what is the possible connection between architecture, if there is such distinction, we don't believe it is there, but for the public opinion, there is the distinction with architecture with a capital A, with the architecture of the everyday that we do with a lowercase a. So is there any kind of transit and flow of knowledge from that capital A architecture to the one that we do? And then what do we bring backwards to that architecture with a capital A? It's mainly filtering the superfluous, so no frills kind of architecture. So allow me to start with the first part, which is the nerdy skeptic beginnings in this relationship between architecture and theory. I studied architecture from 1985 to 1990. These were the last years of the Pinochet dictatorship. And in that political environment, information control was an issue. Actually, we didn't get any magazines. We were studying architecture only with old books, I guess because they were less dangerous, and mainly looking at pictures of buildings, not at buildings themselves. So in those years, theory was equal to history. And I had to go through history 1, 2, and 3. That was a sequence of isms, mainly. These were awful courses to have to go through. History 1 from old architecture, history 2, and it was mainly about classifying historical buildings that may be okay if you want to be a critic, but not okay if you had, and we have the problem as students of having to have a studio at the workshop at the same time. So the connection was very hard to build. In any case, my first challenging experience was around understanding theory as history. After third year, theory became a different thing, which was mainly, to put it in some way, to speak in as complicated as possible. So we were trying to use philosophers' jargon, words with less than 4 or 5 syllables were not part of the question. So you had to pretend, and it was a kind of term-dropping kind of attitude to show as if one was intelligent. And actually, we've just opened an exhibition in Denmark, in the Louisiana Art Museum, and we scanned for the first time all our sketchbooks and of that period. We didn't have an archive before that. And I have to confess that going through the sketchbooks, the way I was describing theory was really unbearable. It was, it was so arrogant. It was so I guess that myself had to suffer that notion of theory as a parallel activity that was, again, not connected to practice, but mainly trying to show that you were a sophisticated cultural individual. Of course, having had started with those notions of theory as history or as speaking in complicated within the years of the dictatorship, where by definition you had to be against what was official, created that kind of rebellious attitude and that reasonable skepticism that I guess tempered how at the same time one was trying to swallow a field of knowledge, a body of knowledge, and at the same time being critical and skeptic of what you were swallowing. And I guess a good example of that could be the project that I did in third year, for a taxi driver. And in that studio, we were required to do an individual or a private house. You could choose the client. The normal attitude would be to look for a client that was sophisticated enough so that as if from the quality of the client came the quality of the architecture. And of course, the least that you could talk about while explaining your project was Heidegger and was void and existence, so that kind of really big words. And by being skeptic, I wanted to know what all that had to do with a friend of my father, that was a taxi driver, that wanted to park the cab inside the house because that was the only means of survival, and if it was on the street the next day it wouldn't be there, or a family that had the refrigerator in the living room because it was a sign of status. So how was that normal everyday life connected with that big architecture? Was the kind of things I was questioning. These are among the things that we did was to scan projects that were somewhere. Finally, we discovered that, and this was the third year project of a house in the city center for a very conventional client. And I guess this went rather well after being submitted to reviews. And I guess it's important that at some point during your formative years, you're encouraged in that being rebellious and being skeptic, because it would have been very easy for some professor to dismiss you. And I guess that was a turning point somehow, that in that critical attitude, you get some good feedback, and it encourages to keep on doing that. And I guess it's crucial for what we do nowadays. If anything, I would call our practice a fight against the cliché. And this, I guess, comes very early on in that notion of theory as being as conscious as possible of the decisions that you're intuitively making while designing. The second thing I would like to talk that I think is important in the formative years is the role of my mentor and very important professor I had to happen in my very first year, Fernando Perez. He was at the same time professor of theory and workshop and studio. So he was saying, it's a kind of quote, of course he may have spoken about this more elegantly, but what I remember to have got is that the moment you open your mouth, you're thinking in public. So make sure that you think carefully, solidly, with clarity, aiming to sharpen the problem and the forces at play, instead of using thought just to erase the edges of the problem or throwing big words just to get the audience or the client confused. From those very important formative attitudes that I got from Fernando Perez, he was, I guess, trying to communicate all of us that we had to be in a hurry to swallow the body of knowledge of architecture, both in the built and the written form. So his course was not called History 1, 2, or 3, it was called Introduction to Architecture, a course that I happened to teach afterwards, following his paths. And there we got in contact with the Vitruvius, with Alberti, Palladio, Durand, Boulez, Ruskin, Loos, Corbusier, Mies, Kahn, van der Laan, Aldo Rossi, or Robin Evans, just to name a few. So it was important that at least one professor during that period understood theory as that lessons from those who have the problem of the blank page in front, which I'm going to talk about later. These was the historical international body of knowledge that, being far away in the corner of the world in Chile, we desperately needed to have access to. But we had a couple of local examples. Chile is not Peru. We did not have an empire, so it was very hard to look for high-quality architecture. But there were two experiments from the 60s that I guess that helped to create that intellectual approach to architecture that gave some sense to the operations. The first one being the School of Art. I studied at the Catholic University. This was the Catholic University of Valparaiso, which is a city 100 kilometers on the Pacific Ocean. And they were trying to explore the relationship between poetry and architecture. This is a very unique example and a very original approach. And actually, they were not just studying or teaching that, but actually they were living according to that. Professors and students were having this open city on the dunes, on the seaside, making experiments of how some, in this case, it's not theory, or let's say, but in poetry, as a way to find an original foundational approach to what does it mean to put an object there in the built environment. So that was one. And the other one, somehow in conflicts and around the same years in the 60s, Juan Borchers trying to find the relationship between mathematics and architecture. And actually, Borchers was a kind of thinker that wanted to put a finger in almost every aspect of the human existence, from science to botanics to biology, geology. So even though they may have remained a little bit outside the conventional practice, there was an epic or a kind of sense that there's something here that matters. And I guess that that sense or that feeling or that emotional approach to knowledge was important from these other schools that were brought through Fernando Pérez to my formation in Universidad Católica in Santiago. A third moment in my formative years came from another professor, for Fernando Pérez being one I had in the first year, Hernán Riesco being one I had in my last year, was a fifth-year professor. And his way of, he was a practitioner, but his way to approach theory, and which I'm very thankful for approaching how to frame the problem of a project that way, was to put it as if it was a riddle. So he was trying, as if every project that you have to deal with had a menu of problems that you had to discover, and it's a kind of inevitable menu of problems attached to each of the typologies that you're dealing with. So it was your task, first of all, to understand what that menu was, and then to choose among that, because even if inadvertently, you may have been choosing something without knowing there was a choice. So questions like, how many ways are there to enter a building? As if there was a correct answer. Of course, for us as students, it was natural. We never thought that it was his particular approach, but framing the menu or the kind of things that you have to pay attention to was important. How many elements maximum can a student deal with in a composition? What's the problem of an L-shaped building? What are the core problems of a tower? And these kind of things, I guess, still today are relevant in how to frame the question before even jumping into the possible answer of a project. Designing the question in our practice is extremely important. We spend a lot of time initially in designing the question before even jumping into the solution. So as the sum of 1, 2, and 3, I guess that in that relationship between theory and practice was this rebellious, skeptic, nerdy kind of approach, reading a lot, drawing a lot, and mainly measuring buildings a lot. Somehow, that approach theory created the hurry to swallow those centuries of knowledge that we somehow felt we were missing while being trained in architecture in Chile. There was a fourth moment in the formative years, already outside from the university, that I would call the expansion in Venice. When I went to Venice in 1991 to make, as if I was studying, I had to apply to a scholarship. Who on earth would go to a classroom in Italy, or your professors, their buildings themselves are on the street? So, but I needed a scholarship to be able to survive in Europe. So I went to Italy, mainly to be able to do the Voyage d'Orient de Corbusier in reverse. While being in Italy, I guess theory acquired a new dimension it was unknown for me in Chile, which is theory as culture. To name a few courses I had to follow to justify my scholarship in Italy: old and modern tragedy, literature, the Divine Comedy by Dante, professors like Tafuri, Dalcó, Cacciari, Orrella, where there was, for the first time in my life, I was able to have a direct contact with the original treatise of, you went to the library and there was the original thing there from 300, 400 years. That never, ever would have been a possibility in Chile. But in addition to that, you close the book, go to the street, and the buildings that you saw in engravings in the book were built. And this was just fantastic. So I followed the advice from Hernán Riesco, the professor, saying that, okay, if you go to Europe, make sure you take your sketchbook to draw, but mainly your measuring tape. Make sure you measure all those buildings. So this is, I guess, what started as the really nerdy years of my formation, when I went to follow the path of the Voyage d'Orient de Corbusier, going to Greece, to then Rome, Istanbul, or Palladio, both at the residential scale or at the building scale. It started in 91, but actually never ended for many years. I was coming back and forth and over to old architecture, drawing and measuring. So understanding that architecture in that sense reflects the society that allowed it to happen, the technical and advancement and means that were available at the time. What was the sensibility of that society that were looking or allowed to do things in one way but not in a different one? Where these dimensions, and going back to words of Fernando Perez, he says that a good architectural work is at the same time a mirror and a cloak. As a mirror, it's a cultural object that if you pay attention, careful attention to, it should be able to resist that careful look, and to the point that eventually reflect as a mirror that period in time, that society, the advancement of humanity, or even the author. At the same time, a good architectural work is like a cloak that should be able to disappear in the corner of the eye so that you don't even pay attention to architecture, and that place allows you to do what you're supposed to be doing, like meeting here. If we place with this eye attention to this auditorium and interrogate it as a cultural object, we should be able to write an essay of what the moment in time where this was built, the proportion, the acoustics and everything. At the same time, if this was not properly designed, we would be paying attention to it because it doesn't allow us to just meet and gather and have a conversation. So that going from being in background to being at the forefront to paying attention to not paying attention to it at all was the kind of things I was trying to investigate, understand what were the operations that were put in place by the authors. And this was the Italian school combined with my formative years in Chile. So from that on, I guess I graduated in '92. My personal private practice started in '94 after having gone to Venice. So when there was the moment that after having swallowed all that body of knowledge, you have the problem of the blank page in front of you. Theory acquired a new dimension, which was, how do I make that jump into the void? How do I take that risk of doing a proposal? Because to make an analysis or as a research, somehow it's seen as less creative, even though it requires a creative eye to be able to penetrate the reality of a building. Yet the blank page had a new dimension to it, which was, okay, how do I start with? How do I start that infinite chain and process of decision making? So I tried to organize all those experiences I had as a student in the form of the courses I would have liked to have at the university, but I didn't. So from that were the years where I was trying to put into a written form all those lessons I was trying to extract directly from buildings, being the most important one, a book that was written together with Fernando Perez and another architect, José Quintanilla. And I think the name is important, Architectural Facts. It was about trying to extract from buildings all those lessons that actually happen in a way because there were the decisions in the form they had that produced that kind of life. So how accurate can we make the jump into the void from wanting something to actually delivering what you want and not doing something else? So these were and this was mainly about my own studies, and these were more collection of texts that also help that jump into the void, which is the decision-making of trying to improve and be better than the blank page. I was not interested in knowing about architecture. I was interested in learning from architecture because of that problem of the blank page. Somehow, to design is to prefer. And there's people that prefer better than others. I wanted to put myself on the footsteps of that infinite chain of creative decisions, the forking paths in front of the blank page. So I read, I draw, and mainly measure the sequence of small jumps into the void where intuition synthesizes knowledge in order to organize information in a proposal key. I guess that it was a kind of hope that while measuring a building, you're going backwards to that moment where you have to choose square or circle. If square, how high, how deep? What's the material? I mean, it's an infinite chain of decisions, and I wanted to be somehow guided by those that made better decisions than others. I guess that while measuring, you're able to connect in an intimate way to that problem of the blank page in front of you. This coincided with the moment of my first building. The book was published the same year. I did my first building ever, which was the mathematics faculty for the Catholic University in 1998, where, if anything, tons of concrete was being poured in front of my eyes. And I have to confess I was scared to shit to have made a mistake while designing this building. I mean, it was really amazing. I don't know, was less than 30 years old. You draw a couple of parallel lines on a piece of paper, and those lines meant a wall. Hundreds of workers working there, trying to pour the concrete inside the formwork. And I said, and what if I made a mistake with the lines I was drawing that apparently was nothing? I mean, it was a piece of cake just to draw things. Well, those things were tons of material. It was money, it was energy, it was people. You actually never do your own stuff with your own hands. You do it through the hands of others. So you better make sure that the instructions that you're giving are going to end well. So I guess that I was trying to, by drawing and writing, to connect with common sense and a certain humbleness. It was a moment where I was forced to abandon theory as a pedantic rhetoric thing. It was so self-explanatory that if you were pretentious and arrogant and all those formative years with these big words, while going onto the construction site, this was a different thing. And so you better make sure that you use your words just for carefully directing your operations more than adding stature or glamour to what you're in the end are building. That book, Architectural Facts, and that building that was finalist in the Mies van der Rohe Award got me an invitation to teach at Harvard. And that was in the year 2000 and was the birth of Elemental. At Harvard, I learned the hard way that my theories and practices had to be confronted not with other architectural theories and practices, meaning with other architects, but with the theory of and practices of other disciplines. I realized I was so lost and so irrelevant in what I was trying to do as an architect. Because when you go to Harvard, to the School of Public Policy or the School of Public Health or the School of Law or Business, these guys are trying to deal with those really big issues of the world, and there I was with my nerdy knowledge of architecture that only interested other architects. So I was trying, I guess I was forced in a very tough way to find a way so that theory, or whatever architectural theory and practice was, had a conversation with these other fields of knowledge that were trying to have an impact into reality. In the year 2000, for example, I did know, and all these things that were fancy at the time, fractal space, deconstructivism, postmodernism, parametric design, but did not know what a subsidy was. In a country where 60% of what gets built uses some kind of subsidy. So the same way, there is I don't know the expression in English, where you feel embarrassed for the person next to you doing something awkward. Well, this was self-embarrassment. It was not possible that I didn't know what a subsidy was in a country where the majority of the square meters are built using subsidies. So in a dinner, with the Minister of Housing, it was a lawyer, my age, 33, and 2 engineers, among them Andres Jacobeni, studying at the Kennedy School of Government, that ended up being one of the founders of the Elemental. I was the only architect in a table of 4. It was a unique opportunity to set the agenda, I mean, to talk personally to the minister. In Chile, I would have never, ever had the chance to talk to the minister. There I was on a dinner, being able, the architect on the table, well, to talk about housing policy, and I didn't know what a subsidy was. And I just saw the ball pass in front of me, equal self-embarrassment. Them, engineers and lawyers, talking about policy. They were deciding the future of hundreds of thousands of subsidy per year in a relatively small and poor country. And I didn't have a thing to say to contribute to that conversation. So my architectural theory and practice was no contribution to their social, economical, or public policy theories that were trying to improve the life of millions in my home country. There I understood that my theories had to go underground and become intimate and silent, and be there only in the private realm as the guide for the praxis to be able to engage in these non-architectural problems, all the other ones on the table we're talking about. As Hashim Sarkis said, at the time he was a colleague at the Harvard GSD, and now he's the dean at MIT, he was saying that the challenge to architecture was to contribute with the specific knowledge of architecture, that of form making, to non-specific problems like poverty, insecurity, inequality, sustainability, or quality of life, which are issues that every single citizen has the right to have an opinion, and to which, in order to engage, we had to contribute with what we know to do best, which is to give form to the places where people live. So this connection between non-specific problems and the specific knowledge of architecture, which is that of making forms. And it's around those years that we started Elemental, starting as a social housing initiative, and we started by swallowing all the constraints and restrictions of a public policy. And just for you to understand what do I mean by constraints, it was at the time $7,500 subsidy with which we had to buy the land, provide the infrastructure, and build the house for a family. If you didn't follow those rules, well, you were out of the system. And those 3 realms were split in 3. So in the end, whatever you have had studied, and Palladio and Alberti and all that, well, you had to deliver with $2,500. Can you do that? So I guess that was the reason why all that knowledge went private and silent. And if anything, was what I needed privately to make sure that if I'm going to draw, those drawings were a contribution to these things that hopefully mattered. That is why, and this was put in the form of a book, and that book was about mainly a manual for doing social housing. That is why we at Elemental opted to call it and actually operate it as a do tank, and not as a think tank. Theory from now on was going to be whatever was necessary to think and study and reflect to make the jump into the void of the blank page, which means the risk, more precise. But it was going to remain private, never become a discourse or a manifesto. And I guess ever since, and that's why I say this award is challenging, never ever again we have made any kind of theoretical discourse in a more conventional sense, because if it's there, it's as a way to guide our practice, but never becomes something in itself, which I think is a more conventional notion of theory. So, how was that intellectual background of architecture with the capital A going to serve our practice in architecture with the lowercase a? Well, that's the book that Phaidon launched today, actually 5 hours ago, which is this book. So it's, we're very happy to finally, it's not a theoretical book, it's a book about sharing the internal cooking of a project that might be useful for all of you that have the problem of the blank page. It tried to create, what does it mean to make those choices? What are the moments where you have moved forwards, eventually you realize you made a mistake, you have to move backwards? How do you talk to clients? How do you talk to people? How your buildings will connect to society and be a contribution, and at the same time, keep that integrity from within the profession. So that's why we're so happy about this book. I think there are some of those here outside this room. So, but it just happened, and actually we coordinated it. Actually, knowing that the award was going to be given today, we forced ourselves to finally publish the book in which we were working for the last 4 years. So we're really happy about this. In the end, what we do is to give form to the places where people live. It's not more complicated than that, but also not easier than that. The question is, what informs those forms that we produce? Society expects from us architects the highest standards in aesthetics. And it's true, we have to deliver that. But that is only one of the forces at play. And it's fair enough that society expects us that more artistic approach in the form making. But that is a necessary but not sufficient condition. The economical, political, social, legal, environmental forces inform our forms as well. And that is why at the beginning of every single project, we do not know what the end form is going to be. We spend time in designing the equation, meaning x equal question mark, the form of a project. And we work very hard to try to identify what is the case to inform the form of this project. Is it budget? Is it timeline? Is it a legal procedure? Is the community that is expecting for many years something? Is the fear of that community? Is it the desire of that community? So it brings together tangible and intangible aspects of a given problem that we're trying to give shape while we're designing. So to end, allow me to share with you 4 examples of how we've tried to translate that architectural theory and how it has powered our practice. Not, as I said, as a manifesto, but almost as a confession on the internal cooking of a project that might be useful for others that have the problem of the blank page as well. Being the first one, and which I picked just some of them are in the book, actually, the Laurentiana Stair by Michelangelo. Sorry, that's the book. So, the first example, Laurentiana Stair. And the title I gave to this example was Being Forced to Look Only with the Eyes, Not with the Mind. What did I learn from Laurentiana Stair? Actually, I have to start by saying, why did I even go to study Laurentiana Stair? Among all the things that you have to study, why go to this stair? I was curious about this object that somehow felt too big for the room in which it was. If one looks at the engravings of the Doric temples of Parthenon, for example, you have the statue of Atenea inside. And if that statue would stand up it will go out of the room. Somehow there are objects that are too big for the rooms that they contain. And to me, the Lawrenceana stair was intriguing in that sense. So I went to Florence while being in Venice, and this is what I mean. It was very hard to be in a room when you have, a couple of hours away in train, that stair. So I went there with my sketchbook to there, and when I arrived there, there was a big sign outside saying, no photographs. Fine, I didn't have a photo camera, so it was okay. I took out my sketchbook and began to draw. The guard approached, said, no drawing. I mean, look, but there's no prohibition, nothing like that said in the sign. No, I can't care less, no drawing. So I took out my measuring tape. No measuring. What do you mean no measuring? What can I do then? Well, you can only look at the stair. Can I walk up and down? Yes, you can. So I was forced to count. And the interesting thing is that I was going up, down, from the center, then on the side. If you go from the center, where there's actually the steps are curved, so when you enter the room somewhere here, you naturally will go up that way. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 steps to that middle step that brings together the lateral steps and the central one, 10. If you go from the side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, sorry, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it's hidden here, and 11. From here again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. How come one of the most repetitive elements in architecture that by definition, if you alter the rhythm, actually they become dangerous, was able to have from the center 10 steps and from the side 11? Was I right? I actually was coming back and forth many times to make sure if what was wrong with this thing. Or how was it possible that one step was hidden only in the distance of 10 or 11 steps? And actually, if you begin to now pay more attention, careful attention, look at the distance between that step and the base of the balustrade, and how distant is that over there? Actually, in the introduction of this balustrade over here is to hide the non-coincidence between the lateral steps and the central one. In addition to that, the central stair has grouped stairs, and all of you that have designed a stair know that depending on how much horizontal landings you introduce, the slope of the staircase changes. By having here a continuous flow of 10, and here the 10 steps were grouped in 3 plus 7, you even increase that slope. So how is it possible that in this stair, this anomaly was introduced? So by starting from the reality and actually, well, of course, then I took advantage of the guard at some point, had to go to have lunch or to the bathroom, and so I started measuring the thing. I also went to the library to understand who has wrote about this thing. Who can explain why is that thing like that? There was scripts and essays by Giulio Carlo Argan, also by Rudolf Wittkower. In none of them was the question of the number of steps mentioned. I mean, particularly the Wittkower essay is a 70 pages article on the Lawrenceana stair, mainly on the history of the construction of it, no mention to the architectural facts. This is what we were trying to call an architectural fact. This is a fact that steps are grouped that way. There's 11 on the side, 10 on the center. Why is that? Of course, then, if you have access, and this is the great thing about Italy, to the original archive of Michelangelo, then you understand that he was drawing the stair at the same time he was drawing sculptures. So for him, architecture was mainly a question of muscles, forces, tension, tendons. And the way he achieved, or why that perception of, fill the room with very little means, well, if you see that curved aspect over here, so that it's like when in a sculpture, your chest moves forward, and then you lean backwards, your arms. So some tension is introduced. There's a huge amount of small operations that we're performing as if this was a body in tension that somehow explain why this room was filled with very apparently inoffensive moves. Actually, at the very beginning, when I was only allowed to count, I was able to acknowledge the fact that it was 11 over here, 10 over there, but when the guard left, I was able to measure it, and actually the stair is not parallel to the side. So hidden in the perspective, that tension of this between the stair and the room that it contained was explained by how everything was skewed somehow. Since I was allowed to touch the stair, I was putting my hands around, and the diameter of the balustrade in here is 51 centimeters, and the one here in the bag is 37, and actually I could cross my fingers. All of these operations that were hidden below the threshold of perception in the perspective of the building. So what did I learn from that? That how to fill a room with very little matter, how to deliver with very few means, and this is not that different from what we're required to do in social housing. You're giving very little means, yet you need to make that operation to be able to overcome and take over the built environment. And it's a distant lesson, yet it is filled with that kind of, this is the way we as architects and designers have to engage with non-architectural issues. The second example is the Doric temple. I was interested in this because it's almost the definition of perfection. If in a staircase is almost the stereotype for repetition, where Doric and Greek architecture is what we have somehow identified as the notion of perfection, identifying in addition to that perfection with regularity. But that perfection, in the case of the Greek temple, was achieved through a series of anomalies that are all, again, under the threshold of perception. So there I went, in May, the classes are over. First thing I did, to take a train down to Sicily to study the Doric temples in Sicily. Of course, that were added to the experience I had in Greece before. So this is what we're all seeing, and this kind of very regular, perfect architecture that I was interested in understanding and trying to extract some lessons from it. So I started just by drawing. This was Segesta in central Sicily. Of course, when I was studying in Chile, looking at pictures and not even of the books, but the photocopies of the books, you lose all the joints of that architecture. So what was something that was very striking to me was how many pieces of stone were building that architectural knowledge. So actually there were pieces that had a weight, had a proportion, and that could be elevated to that height. So it was a very practical thing that connected with a very abstract thinking, that of the classical architectural grammar and language. Here there was no guard. Incredible. I mean, I would not have ever thought to arrive in Sicily, and there you had cows going in between the temples, so you could measure them very easily. And what struck me was that at the central distance between the columns that were 214, or that is more or less regular here, when you arrived to the corners, this was 2.2 or 2.1. So there was 13 or 12 centimeters difference between the distance in the columns at the center and that on the corners. But you could have never, ever, with the bare eye, the naked eye, have thought or realized of such difference. Of course, you have read about it. You have read about all the transgressions to the rule in Doric architecture, but I never had the chance to understand what it meant until I was able to measure the temples. So, yeah, that was the case for the temple in Segesta, and there are many temples that are accessible in Sicily. I can't remember which one is which, but again, that anomaly of having 10 from 12 or to even 20 centimeters, depending if it was a 6 or 8 column temple, was consistent. Over and over, you found that in all the Doric temples in Sicily. And I guess that what I started to focus then was, how was that corner built? How was don't know the name in English, triglyph, is it called like that? And the metopes and the rhythm between metopes and triglyphs, which is constant and regular. That doesn't change. It begins to be altered are the columns underneath to make sure that the rhythm of how you are telling a myth. And a myth is the ultimate explanation of reality. Reality made sense to Greek because of the myth that was there in the form of, as if it was the screenplay of a film. So that myth that was so fundamental couldn't be altered, and the rhythm between showing it and not showing it. Actually, from the Valparaiso school, the one that was exploring the relationship between poetry and architecture, I remember that the poet, those were two founders, an architect and a poet. The poet said that the word meiein, it's an old Greek word for myth that means to blink. So his explanation of the Greek myth as a poet was that reality is so strong, like the sun, if you look at it directly, that you won't be able to resist it. But if you blink or you close your eyes, eventually that same reality, which is the ultimate purpose of a myth, allows you to deal with reality in its most radical form. So I guess that is why the regular propagation of that rhythm and the eurythmics of the Doric temple and that sequence between method and triglyphs had to be not altered. And for guaranteeing that, if you begin to put into the equation, okay, the width of the stone, in the end, you have to arrive to the corner with a stone that has some width. Of course, in paper, it doesn't matter. You don't draw the lines, it's just form. But if you have to build it, then you have some tons that you are able to lift or not. There's a maximum distance between the columns, so that a system working in pure compression allows for the own weight of the stone not to break it. And in addition to that, you have the problem of, okay, if I arrive to the corner, how do I decide which stone goes in the front, which one has to be cut in the back? I didn't have access to that, but you could tell with a bare eye, with a naked eye, that the corner of the stone from the front had a preference of passage, let's say, compared to the stone on the side. But how did they solve the problem with the internal stone? I do not know. It would be great to be able to go on top of a Greek temple to understand how that corner is built. So actually, after measuring it, if you go backwards to that thing that you've seen as, yeah, this is perfect and perfection, and begin to look at it again, it's obvious now, after having measured it, that the distance between those two columns, it's much bigger than the one along these columns. And actually, the cutting of the stone here, the cutting of the stone there, the cutting of the stone there is always in the axis of the column. But when you arrive to the edge, you can't do that. It has to go beyond the whole capital over here. And actually, the stone over here, normally the rule would be this piece of stone that is carved here, it has 6, how it is called in English? In Spanish, the translation will be drops. The drops underneath the triglyphs. It will be 6, 3, and 3. So that triglyph over here is divided in 2 of the stone that is built underneath. 3, 6, 6, 3, 6, 3, 3, 6, 3, and that's the rhythm. When you arrive to the corner, you have 3, 6, and 6. So that stone is slightly longer than the ones from the side, and in order to compensate that extra length, that column has been pushed to the side, because in addition, you have to turn around. Actually, it's very precise the way it's turned around. The way that triglyph is carved, it has 45 degrees flat, 45 inside, 45 outside, and it arrives with a 45 double angle over here. So you have this kind of perfect turning around the column, but all those things are kind of calmly put in there with a huge amount of architectural operations that were put into motion by somebody that knew exactly what could be perceived with the naked eye and what couldn't. So I guess that the lessons from here was, and it was connected to maybe one of the problems that we're normally dealing with, a system like the Doric one that is so perfect that risks to be dead, has a series of imperfections and anomalies that introduces a principle of vitality into the system. That same thing applies when you're working in social housing with repetition. I mean, in order to achieve economies of scale, and I guess this has been the historical criticism to social housing, you are forced to be repetitive, industrialized, things are equal one to the other. And this is incapable of reacting not only to the diversity of people living inside, but it has some quality that it's not fair to a right quality built environment. And here it was, this structure, full of anomalies, so that when we said, well, when we are forced to, it's not a choice, because of economical reasons, to be repetitive, can we introduce some anomalies so that we regain that vitality of the grid temple? Actually, the reason for this is not economical. In the case of that innovation center of the Catholic University in Santiago, that building, for different reasons, risked to be a dead structure because its compositional principle was so simple that even a child could follow it. Actually, a person that was important in my formative years, and he died, Rafael Iglesias, a brilliant, brilliant Argentinian architect. He had a building in Rosario, in Argentina, that he said that this building that was irrational. It was logic, but irrational. And the reason is that the next move, you don't have to think about it. It's self-explanatory what is the next move. So in a structure that follows such a logic yet irrational compositional principle, we had the risk of having a dead system. For seismic reasons, this building also had to be very regular. The moment you offer different amount of mass, well, in Chile, you may not know, but gravity, vertical forces are irrelevant. We care about horizontal forces. This building weighs 17,000 tons. If it was a glass building, it would have weighed 17,000 tons because the amount of matter you need to resist the acceleration of the ground, it's crucial. And to have it in the perimeter is even more important, and it has to offer, because you never know in which direction the earthquake will come, you have to offer a regular structure from that point of view. So it risks to be dead. So the only operation we allowed ourselves as a degree of freedom as architects to introduce some of that vitality that we observed in the Doric temple was those 2.5 centimeters in the corners of the building. Actually, it's not a straight corner. If you look at it carefully, it's slightly shifted towards the side below the threshold. You may not notice consciously, but you go there and for sure something here understands that this building is made out of matter, placed in a way that is stacking one on top of the other. The third example is the importance of Arab geometry, particularly not only when going to Alhambra in Spain, but also of the courses that I had at the university by a mathematician, Manuel Corrada, that was exploring the relationship between mathematics and art. What that possibly can have as a function then afterwards in your professional life. And I would say it was about, I went to the Alhambra, of course, to study this. It was very important, and I was intrigued. I was measuring the Lions courtyard, of course, and here the change of rhythm is evident. So the vibration of the space is no wonder. I mean, you can observe that with a naked eye. But I was more interested in how the geometry on the surfaces of the Alhambra we're exploring how to fill a given surface with one single geometrical shape. And this is a classic problem for Arab geometry. So be it in that form, matrices of 3 directions, or matrix of 2 directions. So these are hiding somehow a square or a triangle in the end. This is another form, the rotated square. So that apparently absolutely useless knowledge found some, and it was not only there. Of course, there's a tradition of that. This is Roberto Matas, the engravings of the Quixote series, which I was interested in the background. Again, how with the one or the combination of shapes you can end up filling a given surface. So I guess that this was absolutely crucial for the very first project we did at Elemental, the Quinta Monroy project, which was that $7,500 subsidy with which we have to buy the land. And actually, if I could have titled a lecture about this, how a square is more efficient than a rectangle to overcome poverty. And the explanation is the following. That city of Iquique in the north of Chile, in the desert, has, let's say, the city where opportunities are concentrated. That's why there's a huge pressure on land to be here. People come to cities looking for those opportunities of jobs, education, healthcare, recreation, transportation. But being the land, and here we are talking about the desert, being so scarce, the price of the land was so high that social housing couldn't be built in the center of the city, and it was built in this, in the upper plateau, 800 meters above the sea level, 16 kilometers away, where the poor were accumulated because their land cost nothing. And the project we were asked to work with was in the center of the Iquique. Actually, the project is somewhere here. It was a slum, and actually the pressure for land explains why the living conditions of that slum are so bad. I mean, people are desperately trying to be included in that network of opportunities that cities concentrate, but land is a scarce resource. So they, how is it called? Hacinamiento, it's called overcrowding. So that's why they're overcrowded, everybody looking for land. The alternative, I mean, when land is a scarce resource, you have two alternatives. You either do something like that, very bad living conditions due to unhealthy high density, or in the periphery, at the end of the road here, we were competing with this. With $7,000, you could build that in a place where land costs nothing. And we had to be able to find a solution for these 100 families to stay in the center of the city in a land that cost 3 times more than what social housing could normally afford. So this was the condition, the original condition of the site. It's an irregular shape, and 100 families live in here at a density of 700, 500 inhabitants per hectare. So if one followed the conventional approach, actually that of the housing policy, trying to have a rectangle in principle being more efficient because you serve more families with every linear meter of infrastructure. In a street, the narrower the lot and the bigger the depth, you have more families for a given amount of square meters of a private lot. So that's why you take a look at every single city footprint and you have narrow front, very big depth lots. It's because of the efficiency of the services on the common spaces of streets, sewage, electricity, water, whatever. So if we followed that path, and then this first approach, we could accommodate 30 units out of the 100 that were needed to be accommodated. If we went to the row houses, where we were narrowing the size of the lot, and this was part of the policy, to 3 meter wide. 3 meters being not only the width of the house, it was the width of a room. So whenever you needed to go to a next room, you had to go through another room. So this is how overcrowding is sometimes the cost and the price you have to pay for achieving land efficiency. So our approach goes back to how can we fill the surface with one single shape? And in this case, even though it's counterintuitive, the square was more efficient than the typical rectangle. And the reason was in the irregularity of the shape of the side. With a rectangle, whenever you arrive to a corner, you're okay when you're in the middle of the street. But when you arrive to the corner, you have to rotate. And you lose efficiency in that rotation of the rectangle. Well, if you're in a 4-side block, that's not that a big deal. But what if you're dealing with a block that had too many corners, though you were forced to rotate very often? In that rotation, the square doesn't care. I mean, it just doesn't matter. So the square proved the most efficient way with one single shape to fill that piece of land, which allowed us to achieve enough density to pay for a very expensive piece of land. And this unconventional approach was due to having made the nerd study of all the possible ways to fill a surface with a given geometrical shape. And because of that we were able, with the modest subsidy, were able to pay land that cost 3 times more, the families that received the housing solutions did not lose their jobs. And because they did not lose their jobs, they were able to put their own resources into the system right away instead of being expelled to that underserved periphery. Actually, to the point that first half of the unit, this is an apartment, there's a house underneath, so a house that owns that property and another apartment that owns that property. In the best of the cases, we were able to build 36 square meters, but we left the void, that void over here. So actually, that apartment was expanding to this side, that one to that side, this one to that side. You can see, this is concrete, this is a partition wall. That one is a panel made out of almost nothing, because we knew families were going to double the size of that unit to 72 square meters if they didn't lose their jobs. So that's why location was so crucial. So if the cost of that first half of the house was $7,000, these units nowadays, and a real estate person will tell you, well, on what that does depend, the value of that property. Location, location, location. And because of that location, where land is a very scarce resource, if you go now into the market and want to buy one of those things, the cost is $80,000. And so this is the way policies in the developing world are property-oriented, unlike the UK or Europe, where housing is owned by the state. When you get a subsidy in the developing world, you become owner of the house. So it's the biggest transfer of public funds into a family asset, and one would like that asset to grow its value over time. All of us, when buying a house, were expected to grow its value over time. In social housing, that is closer to buy a car than buying a house. The value goes down because they're in underserved peripheries. Nobody wants to live there. So I guess that more than in the architecture, except for the surge of dense enough projects able to pay for expensive land without overcrowding, with the possibility of expansion, this is the triad that we were trying to solve, we were able to accommodate the families in the city center and have that value gain as a direct transfer and make housing become not just a shelter against the environment, but a tool against poverty. And finally, and this is maybe the first time we've talked about this, in the end, these things have to have a form. And back to, it's not just old architecture, but more recent architecture. I remember having been very much impressed by Adolphe Loos' Tristan Tzara house in Paris. And I was interested in this operation where, you know, this house has 7 stories. But the voids or the puncturing of the wall is grouped in such a way that a new scale has been introduced. Actually, you have here at least 2 stories. Over here, this guys as something as being part of that basement, and again here. So that operation of introducing a giant order is not just from Palladio, also somebody like Loos did it in this house in the 20th century. Something that for sure Caesar may have known as well. I mean, that grouping and introduction of a different scale. And of course, at a much more modest scale, that same operation was done with the modest means that we had, which is grouping those windows. That was the only degree of freedom we were given as architects. And the introduction of that kind of giant order, I mean, this is mainly about the paint in between the windows. That's what you're given, nothing more than that. But we knew that it was very unlikely that if we do this double height kind of element, architectural element over here, none of that would have ever happened in the second half of the house. So in the kind of silence or the void in between self-expressive architecture, we could introduce something that had some civic scale. We thought we had a responsibility with the urban, with the city, by introducing something that, given that we were unable to know, this was uncertain. If people do whatever they want, will that first have frame that in a way or introduce a new order of some civic scale? So that same operation had been over and over done in our projects, even with different designs. This was after the earthquake and tsunami reconstruction in the south. And again, in that new order does not necessarily appear in the second half of the houses, but somehow there's keeps that double height. You may not say, and that's it? I mean, so what? For us, it's very important to overcome the so what question. Ourselves try to put all the time on projects. I mean, we're going to do this and that, so what? This was a project we did in Santiago, in the most expensive neighborhood. They're proving maybe to the extreme, the point of paying for very expensive land. In here, the double height in the second and third floor window. When this is not done, and these were some church organizations that we were working on, in the end, we decided not to work anymore, and they took our designs and decided to use them on their own, fine. But look, what they did not do was to group that window in here, so the more typical floor-by-floor kind of scale is there, and maybe this is not the most radical example when this is another project in Santiago. The double-scale window over there. It's exactly the same design. They just decided not to paint the space in between the windows. So what is missing somehow is that civic scale that we were looking for, and for us, that even minute, small introduction of some civic quality into the built environment was maybe the only degree of freedom that we found, and I guess theory was crucial to have achieved that. Hope, and this gives us a lot of hope. And you see here the consequence of when people decide, for example, they decided to paint the facade in red. And they didn't keep the color difference between what created the double height window and this one. But that guy understood intuitively that that had some value for the public realm, and I guess that's what we're ultimately all trying to do. With our specific knowledge, try to make some contribution to common good. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I'm torn between my first question and pouring myself a glass of water. But I've known you a long time. I think we've known each other for 10 years. And I never expected this. I saw a new Alejandro tonight, but I never met before. Alejandro the nerd. And it's a really pleasant surprise, actually, and also difficult for me, because I think this is a topic that Charles, whose place is empty tonight, would have really relished getting into with you, and I never knew Alejandro the classicist. But what I would say is that what I always said about you is that you're a very good communicator. One of your real talents, apart from architecture, is as a communicator. And you said something, I remember a very short speech you gave here at the RIBA several years ago when I think you were being honored in a different way, probably an RIBA medal or something. And you said, I'm at the Royal Institute of British Architects. And in Spanish, royal is real, and real is real. And I think what you showed here tonight is how you can translate classicism into reality, you can always, your work is so grounded in the real. And I think that's why we appreciate your work. It's certainly why I have been interested in your work for all these years. So while I pour myself a glass of water, maybe you could talk about turning classicism into the real.
I would like to start with the first statement you made, that me being a good communicator. And I think it's important to double-click on that. I would say that this is just a consequence of, going back to Fernando Perez's lesson, think carefully. If you think about the problem carefully, if you try to identify what are the terms of the equation that you are asked to solve, if you then are accountable for those terms that you yourself agreed, not with yourself, but with people that you're working with, other professionals, the community, the commissioner, the client, whatever it is, then no wonder it is easier to explain it, because it's a way we use to explain ourselves and to direct our infinite chain of decisions that I was trying to describe as part of the blank page thing. You can get lost at every single moment of that forking paths chain of decisions, of creative decisions. So how to keep track of how to, again, recognize the moment where you began to make the wrong decision. So to have thought carefully about, first of all, what's the problem? Second, what are the pertinent tools to address that problem? Among all the tools you have, and that's why I guess we make those studies in, not just in classicism, let's say, but in things that all the others have done, it just offers us more tools from which to pick when we're facing a problem and trying to narrow or lower the risk of making the wrong decision. I mean, sometimes you're too in love with the tools you took just because they looked right. So the question is, okay, is this the best tool for that problem? And I guess that if you've thought about, and theory in that sense would play that role. If you thought carefully about the problem and then the tools, then you can more easily recognize when your decision was just based on other agendas. Sometimes it's fine. I mean, it's because I like it that way. But then have to be very open to recognize that it's just because of taste. Don't disguise that. The communication thing, I guess, it's something that we were required to develop because the nature of the projects that we do very rarely have another architect on the other side of the table. And unless you're able to communicate in simple terms without reducing the complexity of the challenge that you're facing, you're not going to be allowed to keep on moving forward. It's about funding, getting permissions, having people using their energy. I mean, it's so difficult to put one brick on top of the other. I mean, it's really a tough issue. So unless you channel other people's forces and capacity, you're never going to get there. Eventually, you may be given 1 or 2 times, or if you rely on the power of the brand. Yeah, this is an original by X or Y architect. But very rarely, the really tough problems will get that permission to become a reality because there are just too many people involved. And I guess that the only way we've found is to think carefully, and because of that, to explain that carefully so that people are on our side in the effort of making things become that reality that you were mentioning before.
The other thing that I thought was so interesting about the way you approached the lecture tonight, which in a way was an attempt at a kind of classic architecture lecture, was the mathematics. Because it never struck me before how appropriate it was that your first building was the mathematics faculty. But actually, everything you talked about tonight was mathematics. And whether it was counting, Michelangelo's steps or the spaces between the triglyphs and metopes. And it's that the way you translate that, I guess it's the fact that you're always thinking about an equation. And this is what you have, in a way, you've built a career around equations, right? So you have $7,500 to buy the land, you have X thousand dollars for subsidy. The two things don't match up. How do you square that circle? You have to build half of a good house, right? That used to be your mantra. You didn't say it tonight, but half of a good house. And I think it's possible to look at those houses in Quinta Monroy, which I visited, and not see what you did there, actually. I mean, people see the voids and they understand the self-build aspect, but they don't understand the mathematics. And maybe you could talk about that briefly, because I think the mathematics is what has made your practice.
Yeah, you're right. I never thought that the mathematics building may have had an influence. Mathematicians described themselves when I got that commission as machines of transforming coffee into equations. And I get that had a very fundamental truth. Around the coffee, there's the social dimension. I mean, mathematicians, they work in such an abstract things, isolated in their own cell. Actually, that first building was mainly individual cells for these researchers and professors. The moment they went out of the room to the cafeteria, that was the moment where knowledge was shared and was, clashing. Or the moment you said, "What are you working on?" That thing about there were not even numbers on the boards. It's so abstract that one would have expected to have numbers in the boards. There were no numbers. That moment where somebody could say, "Have you heard about the last thing that this other guy did?" Or that moment of sharing, I think it's crucial. And I think it may be the explanation why I mentioned Harvard. When you're going out of your comfort zone and you're not competing with other architects, but you're competing with other professions for who is going to decide the built environment. And this was somehow a desperate feeling I had. Again, I'm being the architect in the table, engineers and lawyers discussing the really tough issues of the world, and you as an architect, when we have more time and more money, we may call you. This is real stuff. So I felt the need, and maybe mathematics or the language of economics was the only bridge I found to be able to engage into that conversation. No wonder one of the founders of Elemental is a transport engineer, Andres Jacobelli. And for him, it's kind of natural to frame a problem in terms of what are the constraints. This may be the most important thing, the constraints. We were trained as architects under the assumption that in order to make your creativity fly free, constraints were removed. So gradually, when you move up in the career, you may have more dimensions to your thing, like the construction, never budget, construction or some laws. But in case the project began to look ugly, then you can change the constraints. And this is something that, from what I understood, from Andres' conversations with around the coffee with him, is that an engineer is required to be creative because of the constraints. So the moment you begin to chart your question with the constraints is the moment where creativity is needed. It's mostly needed. And the constraints, maybe the easiest way to measure is through mathematics, through budget, through time frame. over time, we understood, maybe intuitively, and now is more conscious, that in that equation, and we like to put it in the form of an equation, not because we believe it's a science, but that because of the terms that you identify are the ones that you then are accountable for. So people can ask, so if you decide in your equation, what will inform the form of this project? The structure, budget, time frame, the weather in this part of the country. So then when you produce a form, okay, they go with a checklist that you yourself created. Okay, what about the structure? How is it performing in terms of seismic behavior? The weather, is it sustainable or not? How much energy am I consuming because of the choices you made? So it allows the accountable performance of the building be shared with the ones that are going to end up using it. The thing is that among those terms of the equation are things that are hard to measure, like the character of a building. You enter something and the first thing that strikes you is you don't like it. You can't explain why, but it's just a sad building or an oppressive building. Or if you try to transform that into a method, you're dead. I mean, the moment you try to grasp all dimensions, because I want to do a happy building, I'm going to use colors. I mean, that cliche for sure will lead you to a wrong answer. Or the decoration, because I want to have a building that is more connected to people. And this is what I was meaning with the fight against the cliche. Knowing that those intangible dimensions are crucial, they're unspeakable certainties. They operate, but it's very hard to put a word on it, yet they're part of that equation. So I guess that's what it makes it an art and not a science, besides the fact that there's not one single possible correct answer for that X.
You do fight for the decoration, though. I mean, I think, you know, I remember conversations we've had where I'm thinking back to Quinta Monroy and the way that people completed those buildings and embellished those buildings. That was something that you felt was crucial to the expression of that project. And in later projects, when you didn't give people the chance to do that, because actually the subsidies were going up in Chile, Chile was getting richer and there was more money, or there was more money for housing anyway. And so eventually they just wanted nice houses from you. They didn't want this radical half-house solution where people had to complete it themselves and fill it with this wildly unpredictable vernacular styling. You were deeply disappointed, I think. So can you tell us a little bit about what you learned watching people fill the voids that you created?
Well, first of all, it would have been impossible for us to tailor-made 100 different solutions, and not even in our wildest dreams we would have ever go to the way people are finishing. But in addition to that, it's no wonder the built environment, it becomes such an extension of your personal reality. And I guess that if you're trying to apply your personal taste to that, it's very likely that you're going to fail. I guess that we're more efficient in using our own knowledge, in creating things that will stand the test of time. And I'm very skeptic going backwards to that attitude, rebellious attitude of our own taste. It has happened maybe, that's a part of the formative years that I skipped, even though it's in the book, some years that I quitted from architecture. I started by building, maybe many architects start like that, shops, restaurant, discotheques, interior design, and all sorts of shitty stuff that luckily enough disappeared. So all the anxiety of proving that you have all this talent and skilled capacity of producing forms was out of my system when I was asked to do the first serious project, which was the mathematics faculty. And one of the things while going through the sketches of this exercise of scanning that and having finally an archive was how embarrassing all those designs from the early 90s were. And at the time, I was convinced these were pretty cool. I mean, I thought this is, what I studied for. And after years, I mean, it looks so dated. So that's from the 90s kind of thing. And I guess that architecture, particularly if you build it properly, you want it to last as much as possible, not just in physical terms, but also in cultural terms. And I guess that taste is something that you better not trust. Of course, at some point, taste is like your handwriting. You can't avoid it. I mean, you're recognized because of your handwriting. So if it's going to be there anyhow, why even pay attention to that? Let's focus on things that are more crucial. And I guess that this is the trade-off. Okay, we will take care of some parts of the construction, but sometimes if it's an institutional building, it's the whole building. If it's housing, because of the constraints, we wish we could do that, but there's not enough resources. And even if there was resources, what we learned from that is that the historical criticism to social housing is that in the search for economy, it had to go for repetition, and it left out the variety of preferences, taste, family structures, people wanting to have a business at home, people that have animals, people with a lot of children, elderly. I mean, it's so vast that you can't do that. So knowing that the historical criticism to social housing was the incapacity to react to that diversity, in the problem of not having enough resources was the solution of that historical criticism. So why make, again, the same mistake? Let's keep on focusing on what's the solution of that incapacity to react to variety. And if I'm given $20,000, I'm going to spend them in a better located piece of land and an even better initial part of the house so that it can trigger the next half if families didn't lose their jobs in the process.
So we talked about the mathematics, and the reason why that being important is that you operate in a condition of scarcity. So of course equations are essential, but the other characteristic that I find in your work, at least early on, is this self-initiation. And I wrote a book a few years ago called Radical Cities. You were one of the main characters, and one of the things I was arguing was that in those conditions of scarcity, the architect can find ways to intervene. Not always, but sometimes. And that the architect can be a kind of bridge between people's own energies and capacities, because we know that people can build their own homes on a massive scale. On an urban scale, people can build their own homes, but they can't necessarily build themselves infrastructure or a transport network or a nice, or a well-balanced community. So this idea that the architect can intervene, you did it in Quinta Monroy in a way, I think. I mean, you certainly you lobbied for that project. You really pushed for it. How prevalent is that in your practice now, and how important is it, do you think, for architects to behave like that in those circumstances?
Well, today in this room is 1/3 of our office. So we're 15. We're a big enough practice to be able to deal with complex projects, but not that big that we need projects. We want projects. And it's a privilege, and we're very conscious about the privilege that we have more requests than what we can deal with. And the way we choose projects is according to the level of ignorance we have about those fields. We go into things that need knowledge to be created, that need lobbied. And so the question is actually not there yet. This equal question mark, nowadays in our practice, does not only apply to the form of the building, it applies to the fact that even the client doesn't know what the question is. We were required to package and invent a procedure that we called the workshop elemental, So whenever somebody arrives to us saying, look, I would like to do something in this part of the city, but I'm not sure what it is needed. it could be infrastructure, it could be a public space, it could be housing. Depending on if you go there, swallow constraints, legal frames, but also talk to people. Is this people angry? Is this people, the level of resentment? Is insecure? I mean, am I scared while walking into this street? So you try to identify, before into the form, this equal is the question. And normally we create a possibility to work where in principle there shouldn't have been one. And I guess this is, even to ourselves, has proved to be something, because you're building that question with clients, users. First of all, you're agreeing what's the problem that we have, and only then we move ahead. And I think it has proved over in very different realms, from Artemide to identify what, it could have been a lamp, a technology, or a system, to the Inter-American Development Bank in Buenos Aires, for example, where they, in a very bold decision, the president of the bank wanted to have their headquarters in the middle of the biggest slum in Buenos Aires. But they were not sure if it was right or not, or what the benefit of that. It was a powerful message. But if it didn't deliver any improvement, both for the bank but for the community, it would have been a white elephant kind of approach. It would have been a disaster for other institutions wanting to do the same. So when going to the X equal, should we even do that? What is the question here? What is the problem that we're trying to address while building a building inside a slum? And the conclusion was that there was no building needed. Actually, the way we framed that project was a building inside the slum will need a pedestrian bridge across the railroads because it was disconnected from the city. It will need parking, otherwise people cannot even come to work. And because of all these conditions, and even with all of these conditions, these may have never produced the positive impact the bank wanted to have, because it's a development bank. They themselves said, yeah, we're a bank, but we're a development bank, so we should be doing things differently. And our proposal was that the building itself was the connection to the city. It's a pedestrian bridge, and the bank somehow operates within the infrastructure that now connects the slum with the city. That was not there before, and actually to the point that we had to change the law. Never in Argentina before the air rights above the railroads was available for building. And in order to have that building to connect the slum with the richest part of the city where all these people work, and that the city benefits from these people, we had to change the law. So it required literally, convincing, politically lobbying with people so that we create room where in principle there was none.
I'm being given signals to wrap it up, but I have a final question for you, which is that you are part of a generation in South America that has done extraordinary things in the last decade, I would say. There have definitely been some extraordinary experiments in housing and in urban planning and generally in trying to remediate urban poverty and segregation in these cities. And I wonder whether you feel the energy is still there. And it has to be a quick answer, but...
Yes.